Good evening. I'm Danielle. I'm the Adult Congenital Heart Coordinator at Conquering CHD, Massachusetts. And here with me today, I have Claire Abbott, who is also on the board with me as the hospital coordinator. And I'm so grateful to be able to work with her side by side. She also has congenital heart disease and she's a heart mom, but she herself got lost in care along the way. So we're just gonna kind of ask her some questions about that, and we're happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I currently live in Massachusetts, which is why I'm so excited and honored to be part of Conquering CHD Massachusetts. I'm married, I am a mom, and I work full-time in education policy for the state. And as you know, Danielle, I spend a lot of time volunteering on behalf of congenital heart disease generally and Conquering CHD specifically, because it's become a big part of my life and also sort of my identity.
Can you tell us a little bit more about when you were diagnosed and what your specific diagnosis is?
Sure. And it's funny because my story is going to be really what I was told and not so much about what I remember, which is kind of an important reflection. I was technically diagnosed with an atrial septal defect when I was 1 year old. My parents had just moved to Connecticut. I had a new pediatrician. And he took one listen, heard a heart murmur, and referred my parents to a cardiologist, Dr. Diana. So we had it checked out, and that was the first time we had any indication that I had anything wrong with my heart.
Have you had any surgical interventions or have you had to take any medications?
So I have had one open heart surgery. I ended up having surgery in 1981 when I was 4 years old at Hartford Hospital with Dr. Takeda. And I was in the hospital for 8 days. I have very few memories of this time, and unsurprisingly or interestingly, my mother has literally zero memories because I think it was quite traumatic for her. The memories that I do have are quite vivid. They're kind of like snapshots of things. I remember pre-op tests when they took me away for the first time from my parents. I remember large groups of doctors surrounding my bed, which in retrospect was when they were taking chest tubes out. And my dad was down the hall at a payphone, which gives you an idea of the time period.
Yeah.
And then I have this very, very vivid memory of being home in the bathtub with my little brother and watching kind of an old bandage float to the top of the surface of the water. I do know now that those memories have had quite an impact on my relationships with medicine generally, my anxieties around doctors specifically. So although it was a long time ago, it was definitely a formative experience in my life. I was lucky. I have not had to be on medication ever since. So it was just that one open heart surgery.
Do you remember what age you stopped receiving care?
So I think it was around the age of 16. It could have been earlier. And I do remember that last appointment though, and thinking and being told that I no longer had to have my heart checked, that I was fine.
Oh, they told you that?
Yes, I remember
okay.
Thinking that that was the end. And it was so final that I never looked back, and I had to call my parents years later and say, when was that? And I don't think I had an echo. I think my last echo was probably before I was 10 years old. I think that we were literally told it was no longer necessary. And I think in fairness, that's what the medical profession believed at the time. My heart defect was relatively simple, still is. And the repair was considered successful. And I had no symptoms going forward. So looking back, there really wasn't much data to indicate that people with my diagnosis required long-term follow-up care. I wasn't counseled to monitor my care. I didn't even frankly remember the name of my defect. And my mom will laugh because the number of times I have called her from a doctor's office, texted her, like, what was that thing I had? What was that heart defect? It's an atrial septal defect. Oh, okay. And doctors would write it on my chart and we would move on. I never knew the term congenital heart disease or congenital heart defects until my own children were diagnosed with a congenital heart defect.
Oh, wow.
And it wasn't until then that I even connected it to my own medical history. And it wasn't until then, 3 decades later, that I started wondering if I should return to care.
Okay, so I was also wondering what brought you back to, receiving care, but so.
It was conquering CHD. It was finding them and having them tell me that I should probably go get myself checked out. And I mean, I did. I ultimately did. We ended up. I laugh now, but I was during my life at various times assured that my medical history was being taken into account. In retrospect, it was pretty surface. I was told, during each of my pregnancies that they would look closely at my baby's hearts during that 20-week ultrasound. But I never had a specialized fetal ultrasound or anything like that. And I never received any additional care or support. I ran marathons during my 20s without any consideration for whether my heart could handle it, which it could, which was great. But in retrospect, I'm kind of amazed by that. And I do think it's something that I should have carefully monitored throughout my life. So.
Oh, well, that was my next question. Is if before becoming pregnant, were you made aware of any risks, so you didn't have any difficulties during your pregnancies?
No, I was lucky. I look back, I do have some conditions that I think are connected to my heart that I just never connected the dots. I suffer from Raynaud's syndrome, which is really poor circulation. I had pretty severe scoliosis and sciatica. And I think there's some research that indicates some connections to that. So, I think that we could connect dots, but I think going forward, the most important thing is that I'm monitoring my care now so that I'm able to anticipate or just be very careful about any future physical or medical concerns that might be related to it.
Definitely. Can you tell us briefly about your children and their diagnosis?
Sure. So I have 3 kids. My youngest daughter is Libby. She's currently 4 years old. She was diagnosed when she was 2 years old with 3 congenital heart defects. She has an atrial septal defect like me. She was diagnosed with pulmonary valve stenosis, which was connected to her atrial septal defect. And as well, my mitral valve prolapse. She spent the first 2 years of her life really small. She was diagnosed with failure to thrive, and we saw several specialists in an effort to figure that one out. We saw nephrologists, gastroenterologists, nutritionists, never really figured out why she was struggling so much to get on the growth chart. And she was also hospitalized twice for RSV during her infancy. It wasn't until she was a little over 2 years old that we thought she had pneumonia, and she had an X-ray, and we saw the enlarged heart, and we were referred to a cardiologist. And she ended up having open heart surgery 3 months later. So she is now doing great. Her mitral valve is still leaking a bit, but the atrial septal defect has been repaired, and she's doing really well. She's thriving. And as a result of her diagnosis, we had our whole family checked out. And my oldest son was diagnosed with a bicuspid aortic valve, and it's currently considered functional. So the kind of cool thing is that she and Gideon go see their cardiologist together once a year, and so they kind of hand in hand, literally, walk into that office every summer, and will continue to do so for a long time. So
it's nice they kind of have each other to support going in
Mhm.
together. And your third child's been totally fine.
Oh, the irony is that our middle child is the one with the heart murmur, but it's a totally benign heart murmur. So that's the irony there.
Yeah. Did your kids' diagnosis change the way that you viewed your own care or care for congenital heart patients in general?
So obviously, they were the impetus to my return to care. I would never have even known to consider doing so had it not been for their diagnoses. But as a result, I've really learned about the importance of thinking about congenital heart disease as a lifelong condition.
Mhm.
Again, like the three of us have relatively simple congenital heart defects, but what I have learned and how I think about it is that the heart is it's like plumbing. As soon as you have to make a repair or tweak something in order to make it function better, it's not the same, and it never will be again. And as we grow and as we change, that repair might grow with you, or it might have a different impact on the way your heart functions. So it really does require ongoing monitoring. And in many cases, it might continue to function beautifully. And in other cases, it might result in a long-term unanticipated change in plumbing. So ironically, when I went back to my adult congenital heart clinic for the first time in 30 years, and they did a pretty extensive echo, they were able to determine that my atrial septal defect repair was still holding strong and doing great, but I have another valve that's not doing so great. And interestingly, what they don't know is whether that was a congenital defect or whether it was the result of the repair to the atrial septal defect way back in 1981. And that just goes back to the understanding that congenital heart disease is something that is a function of having these defects repaired, and that just requires ongoing monitoring. So that's what has really changed in terms of my awareness and my understanding of how we should treat and attend to congenital heart defects.
Thank you. So do you have any advice to someone who might be watching right now and no longer follows up or is thinking about maybe ending their regular care with a cardiologist? Just thinking, oh, I'm fine.
Yeah,
I no longer need to seek care.
I guess my advice would be don't be scared. If it's been a long time since you've seen a congenital heart doctor or a cardiologist generally, it's never too soon to go back. And I think it's really important to just get a good baseline around how your heart's doing. The heart will continue to grow and change over time. And I think our understanding of how the heart functions, particularly if your heart has been repaired, has to be informed by that congenital heart defect that was there in the first place. So don't be scared. Go back, get that baseline information about how you're doing. And the other piece of advice I would have is really try to seek out somebody who specializes in congenital heart care, because the way in which your heart is functioning now is a function of how it was treated or repaired or addressed when you were a child. So I think it's really important to find somebody who is an expert in this area so they can understand the genesis of any repair, any interventions you've had as a child and how that has affected your current health. And I would tell my kids to do the same thing. And I have advocated for them strongly. Even today, their cardiologist has implied that they could go 2-3 years without having an echo. And I have asked for that to be annual because I'm very aware of how quickly children grow and how that can have an impact on their heart's function. And they're immediately responsive and agree with that. So my kids see a cardiologist every year at a minimum to ensure that their heart's still doing well and doing what it should be doing.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. I appreciate you sharing your time and sharing your story with us. It's an amazing story.